Welcome to the Clutch Kitten Gaming Podcast, where I play an indie game for 5 hours and let you know whether or not it's worth your time and money. Hello and welcome everyone, this is James, also known as Clutch Kitten, and I am so glad that you're here to join me for episode 28 of the show. It was snowing here in Oregon this past week, so what that meant for me was a lot of the week I was pretending it was summer by playing Stardew Valley on my Switch. As I was playing Stardew Valley, actually one thing that kept popping into my head was, how would I explain this to a non-gamer? They probably would wonder why the hell someone would want to spend hours watering digital crops with a digital watering can in order to better run a digital farm. It sounds so dumb, but that game is one of the most relaxing and fun. Speaking of fun, I also have an amazing time hearing from all of you, whether it be through 5-star reviews on iTunes, interaction on social media, or questions in my email inbox. If you didn't know already, you can shoot me questions about games, this podcast, or pretty much anything you feel like, to klutchkittengaming@gmail.com. And who knows, your question might end up on the show. This week I wanted to answer a question I received from JC Ed. He told me how to pronounce it, hopefully that's actually right this time. He asked, what is your social media preference for podcast interactions? JC Ed, this is actually a wonderful question because I usually mention my social media at the end of the show, and if you're anything like me, you probably just skip through the rest of the show once we're done slaying the final boss. So, the absolute best place to find the show and interact with me is through Instagram at klutchkittengaming. I'm on there daily, and it's a great place to reach out and join an awesome gaming community. Next in line is Facebook at klutchkittengaming. Most, if not all of my posts on Facebook are actually from Instagram. However, I try and check the notifications on there at least on a relatively regular basis. Last but certainly not least for some of you, Twitter. That is actually the worst place to find me because I really suck at Twitter. I think I missed that ship when it sailed off like 5 or 10 years ago, so if you want to interact with me and the show, the best ways are definitely to email me or check out the show's Instagram. Let's take a look now at the news for this week. Today's story was interesting to me because I totally thought it was a joke when I first saw it. According to Oscar Deas on GameSpot, Microsoft is planning to expand Xbox Live to other platforms, which include mobile and Nintendo Switch. This obviously felt like a joke because the big hitters, Nintendo, Microsoft, and Sony, haven't historically been incredibly eager to work with each other. There have been some more recent collaborations between Nintendo and Microsoft, but it has still felt largely like a standoff between these companies because of their competing products in the space. This move does make a lot of sense though when you think about how Microsoft is trying to grab that market share back from Sony. In a quote from Phil Spencer in 2017, he says the following: "Console's important. I love the console space, but it's part of the gaming business. It's not total. I look at those in aggregate, and so it's not actually about how many Xbox One X's do I sell, or how many S's do I sell, or even about how many of one individual game that I sell. I look at, are we growing the number of people who have a relationship with Xbox in some way? It could be an Android user in China playing Minecraft, but that's a person who connected to our platform, who's able to use Mixer, who's able to connect to Xbox Live, meet their friends online. That's the metric for growth right now." That quote makes even more sense now after this move. As someone who doesn't actually have an Xbox, I'm still incredibly excited for what Microsoft is doing here, and it will be interesting to see if and how Sony responds. News is always fun to talk about, but let's move on now to look at this week's game. Today we're going to be talking about What Remains of Edith Finch, which is a walking simulator or an adventure game depending on how you look at it. If you're unfamiliar with the genre, it generally includes games like Gone Home, Firewatch, and even Tacoma, which we talked about on episode 9. What Remains of Edith Finch was released on April 24th of 2017 and is available on PC, Xbox, and PS4. It is definitely one of the older games we've looked at, but I highly encourage you to stick around because this game is worth hearing about. It was developed by Giant Sparrow, which is a development company located in Santa Monica, California. They're known primarily for this game, but they've also developed a game called The Unfinished Swan. Currently, the game costs $19.99 on Steam, although if you're listening to this before February 12th, it's on sale for $7.99. This is actually the first game I've reviewed for the show, which I've played 2 times through myself, and both of those times took me a little bit over 2 hours. It can be controlled with either mouse and keyboard or a controller, and both seem to work well. It's not a mechanically intensive game, so really your controlling device doesn't matter all that much. You see a house in the distance, and not just any house. This is the most unique place you've ever seen. It looks like it's always on the verge of toppling and is somehow stacked to the sky with the most unusual architectural pieces. You haven't been back in such a long time. You can feel the weight of the house, and as you breathe in that salty ocean air, memories start to surface. When you were a kid, all of this felt normal. But now that you're back as an adult, you're afraid of what you might find. What Remains of Edith Finch is set entirely on the Finch property, which is located on Orcas Island off the coast of Washington State. It's actually super interesting playing this game because I've been to Orcas Island and I was actually on the San Juan Islands this past year, so the backdrop was very familiar. For the majority of the game, you play as Edith Finch. Pretty much all you know starting out is that the house seems to have been abandoned and you're returning after a long period of time after your mother's late passing. There was always so much mystery surrounding the Finch family, and this is finally your time to pull back the curtain on what really took place. The crux of the story is learning about your family tree and the fates of each one of those branches. It's actually difficult talking about the narrative without getting into spoilers, because this game revolves almost entirely around the story, but let's do our best. You receive narrative elements in a variety of ways. First of all, you learn about the Finch family just through observation. Giant Sparrow did an incredible job of curating this house in a way that made it feel real. This house feels like it was lived in, and it also feels like you're actually coming back after years of being away. You can sense how complex this story is right from the beginning. Old newspaper articles talking about a member of the family are strewn on the ground outside, and dozens of family pictures and old notes are exactly where you remember them being inside. If you've played Gone Home, you might remember that the actual feel of the house is a bit stale in some parts, especially in the beginning. Although I love that game and studio, Fulbright definitely didn't capture the personal nature of the home in the way Giant Sparrow did in What Remains of Edith Finch. In this game, from the very beginning, you as the player are building an understanding of this family, how they lived, how they ate, what books interested them, and so much more. The second primary way you receive story elements is through the VO, the voiceover. As you wander around the house, certain items or pictures trigger some thoughts by your character. It's not as though she's talking aloud in an empty house. You're hearing the character's internal thoughts. You're really getting to experience the house from her perspective. Those internal monologues are actually quite frequent and are truly core to your understanding of the Finches. You not only get to learn about each member of the family, you get to learn about Edith's perspective and her relation to each person. The last and most unique way you receive narrative is through the memories of your family members. As you slowly work through the house and make it to each person's room, you trigger sequences where you get to experience a snippet of their life from their perspective. I won't get into too many specifics, but what I will say is that these vignettes of your family members are incredible and incredibly unique. Each one of the sequences speaks specifically to that person's personality and interests, and the sequences also speak to that person's flaws. One family member struggled with depression, another with alcoholism, another with self-doubt, another with their unwillingness to deal with loss, and so on. What Remains of Edith Finch doesn't avoid digging into those messes that make every family a family. But what amazed me is how tactfully the game addresses both the good and the bad. Those tough issues were treated delicately, and the joyful moments and positive aspects of the family were relished and respected. This speaks to the quality of writing in the game. Despite this game being only 2 hours long, I was taken on an emotional roller coaster both times I played. I had feelings of joy, sadness, fear, empathy, and the list goes on and on. There's obviously an amazing narrative to the game, but what are you actually doing besides listening to the story, and is it enjoyable? Let's talk first about the base mechanics, and then we'll touch briefly on some unique mechanics that those vignettes bring in. In general, you're just walking, looking, and listening. It's actually interesting how Fulbright and Giant Sparrow have each tackled this type of game in their own unique way. In Gone Home and Tacoma, you're allowed to pick up almost everything and spin it around or throw it. In Tacoma, if you wanted to open every drawer and throw all the pencils on the ground, you could. In What Remains of Edith Finch, your interaction with items is much more curated. You have the ability to zoom your focus in, but you can't just grab anything. Your item interaction is limited to the items the game wants you to touch. For example, in a few areas you need to open a door or window to move on. When that's the case, your hand will reach out and you get to use your mouse or controller to pull open that door or lift up the window. On my first playthrough, it was actually so surprising because I had just come off of Gone Home, where the item interaction almost felt core to the gameplay, but what I realized is that similar interactions in this game may have actually detracted from the experience. One way you can think about the difference is like this. What Remains of Edith Finch is like the Haunted Mansion at Disneyland or your local fair. You walk through a pre-planned path and see the things you're supposed to see and hear the things you're supposed to hear. Gone Home is more like if you just walked into an abandoned house. You aren't restricted from touching things, but the important items aren't necessarily obvious because the experience isn't catered specifically for you. All that being said, the base mechanics of the game are limited. However, those character experiences or vignettes bring in some variance. In those vignettes, you might fly a kite, open a can of peaches, play a monster, control a boat, or do one of many other things, and each one of those experiences has a mini-game-like mechanic. The gameplay wasn't mind-boggling for any of those stories, but what it added was immersion. Each one of those character stories could have easily been a long cutscene, but it's important to mention the purpose of opening that can of peaches or flying the kite. When you actually have to do what the character did, it helps you feel more invested in their story. In my opinion, this is where narrative-driven walking sims, or adventure games, and sometimes even games as a whole, have an edge over traditional movies. When you head down to the cinema and watch the latest flick, it could be tear-jerking or incredibly action-packed, but when you leave, it doesn't usually feel like you're leaving a part of yourself behind because you weren't interacting with the film. You were just watching the story take place. In What Remains of Edith Finch, the stories feel real because you're part of them. Now that we've made it through the narrative and gameplay, let's talk briefly about the art and sound design. In regards to the art, What Remains of Edith Finch doesn't push graphical boundaries or have an art style that's incredibly unique. Ignoring the actual graphical tech, this game is pretty realistic in how it looks, and I believe that was the goal. Don't get me wrong, this game is pretty to look at, but it wouldn't take long for me to name a lot of other better looking games. What I believe is the primary strength of the art is what I mentioned earlier in the show. Giant Sparrow did a wonderful job of making the Finch house feel real, which I believe is much more important for this game than having the newest and nicest tech. On the sound side, the VO was solid. The actress who played Edith was the main voice you hear throughout the game, and she did a wonderful job. Even the smaller characters felt convincing as well. On the soundtrack side, it was good, but definitely nothing to write home about. There was a nice melody through line in the game, but most of the music was just quiet, somber, reflective sounds, and it wasn't really meant to stand out. Let's take a minute now to summarize the positives and negatives of What Remains of Edith Finch. First off, on the positive side, the narrative of this game is incredible. The way each vignette gives you another glimpse into the tangled mess of the Finch family and takes you on an emotional roller coaster is amazing. There is a very short list of games that have made me tear up, and this is on that list. Second, in my opinion, the simple gameplay was actually a boon to the immersion in this game. It keeps you as the player focused on the narrative and the way you get to experience each family member's story by doing something simple like flying a kite was a brilliant design. Third, the realistic feel of the Finch house and talented voice actors enhanced the story every step of the way. On the negative side, I have one small complaint. During one of the vignettes, you play the part of an owl where you have to catch a couple rabbits. The controls are incredibly simple. You fly around like you'd expect, and one button allows you to dive down and catch the creature. Theoretically, you would only catch the rabbit if you were within a few inches, but it was easy to tell that you could be quite far off from the rabbit and the catching cutscene would still happen. This wasn't often an issue, but in a few of the Finch family scenes you play out, the controls of what you were doing felt pretty loose. Maybe it was a deliberate choice so that the challenges weren't difficult, but it felt sloppy in those instances. We've made it now to the final boss. This is the part of the podcast where I tell you whether you should slay the game and buy it, flee the game and avoid it, or farm up and wait for a sale. My verdict is to slay this game. What Remains of Edith Finch is an incredible experience that you can really only understand by playing it. Yes, the controls were a bit loose in some areas, but the mechanical play is really just tangential to the star of the show, the narrative. My recommendation is to invite a friend over or your significant other, pop open a bottle of wine, and experience this game together. I have no doubt that you'll love your time and will be thinking about the Finch family for months after. As always, thank you so much for taking the time to listen in. It was such a joy to play this game again, and I hope that you'll tell me about your experience once you get around to playing it as well. If you enjoy the show and have been listening for a while now, I want to encourage you to head on over to iTunes to give the show a 5-star review. Those are not only encouraging for me, but they go a long way toward making the podcast more visible. I hope you have an amazing rest of your day, and I'll see you in-game.